Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. The Holocaust Center for Humanity, located in downtown Seattle, sits on the land of the Duwamish Nation. The Duwamish are the indigenous people of metropolitan Seattle. If you want to see what Native peoples inhabited the land where you live, please visit native-land.ca. The Holocaust Center for Humanity is now open on Sundays. You can reserve your tickets for the exhibit, Finding Light in the Darkness, on our website. Today, April 20th, is the first day of early giving for the Give Big campaign. This is your opportunity to support organizations doing great work in our community. The Holocaust Center is raising funds to support teacher training. Knowledgeable teachers empower their students to stand up and speak out when they see injustice. All donations will be matched, and you can donate today through the link just posted in the chat. Thank you to the Francis Roth and Stanley R. Schill Foundation for sponsoring this presentation. And thanks to our community partners, Together We Remember Coalition, Pacific Lutheran University's Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, and to our series sponsor, the Tacoma Jewish Community Fund. April is Genocide Awareness Month. This month, we take the time to remember, reflect, and learn about genocides of the past century. According to Genocide Watch, an international coalition of organizations that track genocide, there are 13 countries that are currently at a stage of a genocide emergency. A genocide emergency is declared when perpetrators have already passed the planning stages and massacres and other acts of genocide occur. 13 groups of people are experiencing genocide today. One of the countries on the list is Syria. We are honored to have with us today Hope Leone and Ahed Festuk from the Multifaith Alliance for Syrian Refugees to tell us more about the situation and their efforts to support the survivors and refugees. Hope Leone is Multifaith Alliance's Coordinator of Development and Cultivation. At George Washington University, Hope led a student organization called No Lost Generation, which was founded to support Syrian refugees by promoting awareness, organizing advocacy, fundraising, and creating educational resources for refugees. Ahed Festuk, Multifaith Alliance's Manager of Humanitarian Relief, is an activist from Aleppo, Syria, and one of Syria's pioneer women demonstrators. When the war erupted, Ahed worked to deliver humanitarian relief, raise funds for local Syrian organizations, and trade first aid responders inside Aleppo. In 2016, she sought asylum in the United States, and in 2019, she joined the Multifaith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. She is also a prominent member of the Syrian Women's Political Movement. Hope and Ahed will take questions at the end of the program. Please type in your questions at any time in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Thank you both so much for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alana. Thank you to Linda Matias for connecting us and for all of you for tuning in today. My name is Hope. I work with all of our community partners and supporters at the Multifaith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. MFA is the nation's leading interfaith organization addressing the refugee crisis. We're really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you all today. The Holocaust Center for Humanity and MFA both believe in confronting indifference, promoting human dignity, and taking action. MFA was founded on the idea of never again, and our efforts involve bringing together Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and other faith communities through our grassroots humanitarian and advocacy efforts. We'll talk more about what MFA does in detail later, but to give you a brief idea of who we are before we hear from Ahed, MFA works in Washington advocating on behalf of the Syrian community. We generally work on raising awareness, as we are today with you all, and we supply humanitarian relief to displaced Syrians by sending shipping containers filled with humanitarian relief from the US to Syria. And MFA just this past year opened on the ground medical facilities in Syria as well. When we send relief from the US, we send everything from ambulances to medications to clothing, water purification kits. And over the past 4 years, that's amounted to $170 million worth of relief for the Syrian community. While our name has the word refugee in it, I do want to note now that our programmatic focus at MFA has been primarily doing work within Syria with people who technically aren't refugees. People don't receive refugee status unless they cross an international border. And in the context of Syria, most displaced Syrians are actually still within the border of what was the Syrian state. So as you hear us talk, we may describe the Syrian communities that we serve as IDPs, or internally displaced people, and that's what we mean. And today I'm joined by Ahed Festuk, who I met as our Manager of Humanitarian Relief. But more importantly, she's an activist from Aleppo, Syria, as Alana said. And Ahed is a really wonderful, special person. And she will be sharing what her experience was like during the uprising and what it's like on the ground for civilians in Syria today. We'll also talk a little bit about what the work that MFA is doing to support the needs of these communities and how we involve faith communities in our efforts. So keep questions coming in the chat throughout, and we're excited to answer them at the end. Ahed, do you want to turn on your camera? There she is.
Thank you, Hope. Thank you so much, Elena and Richard, and we are really grateful for the Holocaust Center for Humanity. We are really appreciate organizing this great event. So I'll start by just tell you a little bit about myself and about the work that I've been doing since the Syrian uprising started. So I was born in Aleppo, Syria, came from a middle-class family. I had what was considered to be a normal life, but it didn't really occur to me until much later that normal life at that time meant not to questioning or criticizing the government. By training, I'm an accounting. So when I was working, I never really felt this is like the career that I want to continue, but I worked as an accountant anyway. So in 2011, during the Arab Spring uprising, activists in Syria began to nationwide protest against Bashar al-Assad's regime. Protests called for political reforms and the institution of civil rights, and for our dignity and justice to be restored in Syrian society. Driven by a dream of a free Syria and sense of moral and duty, I joined the demonstrations in Aleppo, in my city, in the very beginning. Unfortunately, the regime retaliated against us with a mass bombing and mass killing and targeting civilians' homes, hospitals, schools, and markets, and also bakers, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Of course, my family left Syria at that time because they didn't really want to continue living in this dangerous situation. So I stayed because I really believed in every single action that I was doing, and I was certain what I'm doing is the right thing. So I stayed. I was trained to be a paramedic. So when the bombardment started, I went to a hospital to provide first aid and maybe just treating maybe with like really small skills, but I was like able really to provide some help for the injured people and civilians at that time. So when the hospital was destroyed, I was one of few people who were lucky to be outside the hospital. So the hospital was destroyed and killing all the staff, and also the people were getting treated at this facility. I wasn't able really to continue that kind of work after seeing a lot of friends killed right in front of my eyes. So I started to kind of looking for other opportunity to help my society. So there was like few international and local organizations providing humanitarian aid. So I started to work with them and just kind of like alleviate the suffering that was happening at that time. So at this time, my city was kind of like turned into two parts. One part was under the Syrian regime control, and the other part was against was under the group against the Syrian regime. We call them Free Syrian Army. So this area was under the bombardment on daily basis. So the need was huge always. And the family who stayed there at that time, I'm talking about like 2013, they were really in a huge need and they had no other place to go. So they had really to stay in their home, even though they know that they might be killed after a while, or maybe the same day. So living in this situation, when you really have no plan, you live on a daily basis, like you know that you are alive this moment, but you have really no plan for the future, because we might all be killed in just a second. I stayed there. I did everything that I was able to do. I never regret that I stayed. But in 2015, I also was one of the lucky people to get an invitation to come to the US, as I was working with an organization called Institute for War and Peace Reporting. So they invited me to come to the state and kind of help to inform, or like just kind of like talking with the politicians and people who make decisions regarding Syrians crisis, if you want to call it that way. So yeah, I was lucky to come here and to be one of 4 women who are able to come from inside Syria. But when I came here, I felt like this is not what I want. I don't want to be safe here and see my people being killed every day and not be able to do anything. So I felt I went through this kind of like process of like having this guilt of surviving. And during that time, the Syrian regime was able to recapture most of the areas that was under the opposition control. So most of the people, or actually all of the families, were against the Syrian regime. They had to relocate and to escape to northwest Syria, where they are today. So today, more than like about 3 million people in northwest Syria, where we were, they were relocated from their hometowns and from their home cities, from Aleppo, from Damascus, from Homs. And now they are living in Idlib with really limited access of services. And also they had they have nowhere to go because Turkish border is closed, and they can't go to the Syrian regime territory because they are going to be either arrested or killed. So yeah, I'm able at that time to provide some of the help, maybe not as a huge as like it should, but I'm just trying really to, with the help of the Multifaith Alliance, I'm trying to help my people in providing some kind of like hygiene kits, and we provide medical supplies and medicine. And sometimes if like there is a huge crisis of displaced, we provide tents, and we always trying to like to see what is going on a daily basis to be able to help in this matter. I'm going to let Hope tell you more about our project, but before that, the things is really made me, or I think I made it. If I made it, I think I made it because of the help that this community provided me and the support. I really got the support that I needed to stand on my feet again and to learn the language and to be able to make my community to be stronger, and also to be able to provide the help that I'm providing today. Thank you so much, and sorry if that was long. And yeah, thank you. I'm happy to answer all your questions.
Thank you, Ahed. So just to give some statistics to what Ahed shared here. Oh, hold on one second. There we go. So there are over 13 Syrians that are in need of humanitarian aid today, and 6 million Syrians are internally displaced within Syria. Ahed spoke to there being a high concentration of displaced Syrians in northern Syria, which is where we mostly operate. And typically that displacement happens multiple times. Families aren't just displaced from their homes once, often they're moving multiple times. And 80% of displaced Syrians are women and children. Women bear the disproportionate brunt of the hardships in this crisis, because they are the heads of household in most displaced family structures. And on average, women are typically responsible for at least 6 other people, which would typically include children and the elderly. And just to be clear, this is according to the UN. What's going on in Syria right now is the worst humanitarian crisis that we've seen since World War II. And it's a protracted crisis. We just observed the 10-year commemoration this past March of the Syrian crisis. And so the hardships are compounding, and resources are running thin, and displacement continues. Local resources are exhausted. And so what MFA provides, and what a lot of humanitarian relief operations supply in Syria, really focus on the basics. And this is what Ahed's full-time job is she manages trying to meet these needs and connect our suppliers with the communities that we work with in Syria. So we focus on providing food, shelter, clothing, drinking water, family planning needs, access to education for children. These are all, what we would consider to be pretty basic in the US, but continue to be the largest needs on the ground in Syria. And part of why some of these basics continue to be so needed is because throughout the entire crisis, Ahed spoke about how she was volunteering in a hospital, and that hospital was targeted, and many of her colleagues were killed or injured during that attack. And that was something that was done on purpose throughout, especially at the beginning of the Syrian crisis. Those health facilities were targeted as part of a war tactic, which is against international law, and it's something that is not typically or should not be a weapon of war, but unfortunately it was definitely a deliberate tactic here. And so as a result, a lot of trained professionals, because not only were facilities targeted, but also healthcare workers were targeted as well. And so, especially at the beginning of the crisis, there was a mass exodus of trained professionals. And so the trained professionals that remain, as well as the facilities that remain, are focused on triage. They're focused on, the difficulties that are right in front of them at the moment, and they're reacting to what's going on the ground, but there's not a lot of resources and time for routine health. In the case of women, pre and postnatal care is not something that is very typical for most. And in the absence of a lot of female doctors, that routine care becomes that much more difficult for observant Muslim women. And all of these difficulties in the healthcare system are compounded by, basic malnutrition. So Syrians, if they're not getting enough food and water, more health conditions pop up, and if over 10 years you're not consuming a well-balanced diet and you don't have regular access to get the basics, and you don't have access to that routine care, it becomes that much more difficult to live a healthy life. And so now we're seeing an added impact of COVID-19 on top of that. In Syria, there isn't widely accessible COVID testing, but from where we are testing, we do see that positive cases have increased over the past few months, and mortality rates are increasing as well. And so we know that it's manifesting itself in a lot of displaced people's camps, where social distancing and regular hand washing hygiene is pretty impossible to enforce, just because of the number of people who are living together, and the lack of consistent access to water and to soap sometimes as well. And so beyond the numbers, I think it's really important here to think about, the kind of load that one carries if they're in this situation. I certainly have never endured this type of situation. My assumption is most people logging into this webinar today have never been put in this situation. And we've had the privilege of never having to manage, a life that's consumed with a continual search for basic necessities, a complete disruption of familial and community support structures, extreme financial stress, trying to take care of the women and children and family members that may be displaced with us. And so I just pause to really recognize that the experience is beyond the statistics of what's happening, but for each individual that's going through this, it's unimaginable for someone who is living a life of privilege in the US. And so when I think about what MFA does and how we try to intercede in this very difficult context of overlapping dynamics that are really, really difficult to solve, what MFA focuses on is advocacy, outreach and awareness building, and humanitarian relief, which I mentioned before. And we're really proud to be positioned as a connector. So we connect with communities like all of you today. We connect with our humanitarian aid suppliers in the US, and we partner on the ground with Syrian organizations to get aid to those who need it the most. We're really proud that because of our close partnerships and of our network of suppliers in the US and our network of partners that we work with on the ground in Syria, that we're able to flexibly respond to the needs that are most prevalent on the ground. As things change, so do we. So over the course of our history, our programmatic focuses have shifted. We used to work with the IDF as part of Operation Good Neighbor to support communities in Southwest Syria on that border there. Here's a map of Syria. And so while things were stable, we were able to take on projects like supporting a bakery that made food for surrounding displaced communities. But then Ahed mentioned earlier that things shifted a little bit and people had to go towards the north. And so we weren't able to support that operation anymore. However, because of the surge in displacement, we pivoted and we supplied tents for people who were newly arriving in northern Syria during the winter, which is very similar to winter that I'm used to here in New Jersey. So very, very cold. And so we were able to supply 7,000 tents to house displaced communities there. And now that tents are no longer needed, we're pivoting towards coming up with solutions for more permanent housing for those who are displaced. With COVID-19, we were able to scale up our shipments and send lots of PPE and hand sanitizers and contactless thermometers right at the beginning of the pandemic, even when they were hard to find in the US. And so we're really proud to be able to respond to the needs on the ground very quickly and very efficiently. We have the ability to reach areas that are held by the opposition through our partnerships and soon to come our on the ground offices as well. Other organizations like UN organizations, part of their mandate is that they have to work with the sovereign government in an area. And in the case of Syria, the sovereign government is the Assad regime, which is the main aggressor in this situation. And so it creates a conundrum for an organization like the World Food Program, for example. But because of our network, we're able to bypass going through those types of channels, and we're able to work directly with communities that are less accessible to other organizations. And on that note, we know that 100% of our aid reaches those who need it. I say we, but it's mostly Ahed and her expertise, where she has a lot of oversight over every single step of the aid journey, delivery process from the US, all the way through to its destination. And we have really high reporting standards for knowing that what we sent made it to those who needed it the most. And so in the spirit of speaking with you all today and the importance of the community aspect of all of this, as I said earlier, March marked the 10th year of the start of the crisis. And with the 24/7 news cycle and the opinion of many Americans that maybe we should disengage from whatever is going on in the Middle East, the experiences of civilian Syrians, unfortunately, kind of has fallen off of our radar in the US. And so it's more important than ever that we continue to spread awareness of the realities of what's going on the ground. So again, thank you all for tuning in today. This is a really central part of what MFA does, and I think something that we can all take away from today. We partner with community organizations to raise that awareness, to continue the conversation about what's happening on the ground, so it's at the forefront of people's minds. And we really rely on community organizations to help us expand our network of relief suppliers, covering our logistical costs and advocating for the needs of refugees in their own communities. Actually, at a lot of our events that are similar to this, we've met relief suppliers, we've met new partners, and we really rely on the community network to really help us accomplish what we are looking to do. One of our most popular programs that is a community engagement effort is our Fund a Container program, where individuals and groups, often faith-based communities, will raise $6,500 to cover 100% of the logistical costs of getting a 40-foot container from the US to Syria. And it's a really exciting way for people to get involved in the work that we do and see the impact of their involvement. The way that works is the way that all of our sourcing works, where we identify a need on the ground, we source a solution to that need in the US, and then we are able to deliver that solution to the people who need it. And we have a small staff of just 7 people, including me and Ahed. So community partnerships like this allow us to facilitate a number of growing programs. I'll give you a sampling of what we're up to, but I know that we're nearing the end of our time here. So we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. But just to give you an overview of some of the things that we're doing on the ground, I mentioned that we're opening 2 centers in Syria. One is going to be a primary medical center. The other will be a diagnostic center with MRI machines and things like that. An MRI machine is very hard to come by in Syria, so we're very excited to be able to provide some of that preventive care and diagnostic care that is lacking in the region. We also have a women's relief program. So I mentioned earlier that the impact of the crisis disproportionately affects women because they're typically the ones trying to provide for their families. And so we recognize that at MFA, and we know that often when you try to send a blanket or come up with a blanket solution for everybody, sometimes it doesn't account for the needs of women. So we really prioritize their needs by sourcing women-specific products that they need for pre and postnatal care. We supply a lot of prenatal vitamins to help women overcome the issue of malnutrition during their pregnancies, as well as breast cancer medication and treatment. And that's something that we are continuing to build out. We also are starting a housing program that moves beyond tents into something that's a little bit more suitable for long-term living. Also, we are providing water relief. So there's water in Syria. I mean, Syria is a big place, and so it depends on kind of where you're talking about. But in a lot of parts of northern Syria, there is a lack of drinking water. So some water is trucked in, but it's not safe to drink. And so when people drink it, they get sick. And so we've been hard pressed to try to find a solution to this that's sustainable and that is not likely to be interfered with. So we actually are starting a pilot program that uses really cool patented technology where it actually pulls condensation from the air and turns it into drinkable water, and you can actually hook it up to a school or a hospital. So we're in the process of installing the first 2 of those units, and we plan on installing 15 of those over the next couple of years. And then the last thing I want to mention is our program, a pilot program for educational tablets. So thinking about a crisis that's 10 years long, that's a child's life from the time they're 5 years old until they're 15. And so to be displaced multiple times over that really developmental period in a child's life is really difficult on a number of levels, but especially when you think about their education as well. So these educational tablets have curriculum pre-downloaded onto them. They don't need to be connected to Wi-Fi. And there are options for children at all learning stages. And it's a curriculum that's developed for children in situations of displacement or crisis with that specifically in mind. And so that's something that we are really excited about as well. So with that, I think we'll have Ahed come back on camera. And I think we have some time for some questions.
Yes, thank you both so much. We have a number of questions, and I want to start with one of them that came in for Ahed. It's one of the first questions that we got coming in. Ahed, can you tell us about where the rest of your family is today, and do you still have family that is in Syria?
No, actually, my family in Turkey today, but when they left Syria, they left to Lebanon. They stayed there for 1 year, and then they moved to Turkey. So my entire family, except one sister, she is in France, but yeah, my family in Turkey.
Thank you. All right, so another question that we got, this one comes from Janet, and this could be for either one of you. And she asks, have any of those in the regime been held responsible?
No. Until today, there is a sanction on the Syrian regime criminals or who like participate in killing civilians, but we didn't really see any result until today. So yeah, no one really being held accountable. And this is also, sorry about that. This is also bringing me to something that I wanted to say earlier. Most of the people, or most of kind of international community, when they talk about Syrian topic, they say civil war. And it's not really a civil war. If we want to call it that way, it should be really proxy war, because it is. I mean, we see people from Russia and from Iran came to Syria to fight on our land. And also one thing that I wanted to mention, why still until today no one being holding accountable, because simply the international community being silent, and they kind of pretend that they don't see the atrocities that being going on since 2012 or 2011. Let's be clear. When also during the previous administration, the one before, during the Obama administration, he was saying, if the Syrian regime used chemical weapon, we will take action, but unfortunately no action was taken. And basically that was just a green light for the Syrian regime to keep going with this atrocity until today. So yeah.
Ahed, yesterday you told us your personal experience with remembering what that was like with Obama. Can you share that story?
Yeah, I was in Syria. I was in Aleppo. So when Obama was on the news, and like a lot of people, I didn't speak English, but I saw the news on Al Jazeera that Obama said Syrian regime used chemical weapon. We asked not to do so, and we will take action. And we were like, oh my God, like the American will really hit the Syrian regime so badly. We were very excited. So we didn't sleep that night. My friend and I were like hanging out and waiting. And we waited and waited. Nothing really happened. We fell asleep. But like by the end of the day, we woke up the other day and we were like, what happened? Did the Syrian regime being hit by the American forces? But unfortunately, nothing really had happened at that night. And we know from this night that nothing really would happen, and this regime will stay on killing us day after day without any consequences.
What this is a question for either one of you. It comes from Debbie, who's listening in on Facebook, and she asks, what other countries are helping to provide relief to Syria?
There are a lot of countries from the European Union and from here. But when we say Syrians, we should really be specific, because most of the kind of like the governmental organization, let's put it that way, they don't really provide aid to the opposition area. If, for example, we are talking about the United Nations, most of their programs are based in the Syrian regime territory. And there is like a huge scandal a few years ago, I think 3 years ago, of the amount of the money that was spent by the United Nations, from the United Nations, in supporting the Syrian regime in an indirect way. So they spent like hundreds of thousands on hotel and on like logistic expenses. And like the number were huge, I don't remember exactly. But this is just give you an idea how they go there. Until today, after everything being done, they go and they work with the Syrian regime. But if we are talking about the Syrian, the Northwest Syria and the Syrian out of Syrian regime control, there aren't a lot, but there are like a good amount.
Yeah, this speaks to what I mentioned earlier in terms of how the UN operates in particular. You know, the UN doesn't govern the world, right? So different countries opt into the UN system, and the reason why the UN can exist partially is because it can't tell countries what to do. And so part of the UN's mandate and all of its programs, with a few exceptions, but just to paint broadly, they have to work with the sovereign government that oversees a territory. And in the case of Syria, the Assad regime is still the you know, geopolitically recognized leader of, you know, the area of land that is Syria. And so if the World Food Program wanted to provide, and I don't mean to call out the World Food Program because they're attempting to reach the civilians that are within, you know, the regime part of the territory. But at the same time, to Ahed's point, you know, there are a lot of reports out there that because they have to cooperate with the regime, that not, you know, most of the relief doesn't make it to the people who really need it, and it goes to the regime army. So that's kind of how the flow of relief can work in the regime-held territory. We don't work in regime-held territory. We work in the area that is still held by the forces that oppose the Assad regime. And then another thing to clarify too is when we talk about different countries and the support that they're giving, that support can look like a lot of different things. And just to give you an example, in the US, all US foreign aid goes through USAID, which is the government organization that doles out all of the funds for things like this. And some of the funds could go to the UN, which would make it difficult to reach the areas where we work. But also some of the funds could be earmarked for very specific projects that the US sees as within its best interests. And some of it could be, you know, eligible for smaller nonprofits to apply to. It kind of depends. And it kind of depends on the year and it depends on the administration. So if you Googled, you know, what is the UK giving towards humanitarian relief in Syria, you might get a number, but then it's important to kind of look through how those numbers are earmarked and where that money is going to.
So Hope, you touched on this a little bit, that the places where you're working are safer places. And we got a couple questions asking about how do you make sure your containers and other aid relief is not diverted, stolen, or, you know, somehow taken and it doesn't reach its destination. How do you, has that happened to you, or how do you ensure that it doesn't happen?
I'm going to pull up my map really quick again, because I think that might help answer the question. So give me 1 second here. So this is a lot of what Ahed does. She is in constant contact with our supplier, or with our relief partners on the ground. We work with local Syrian NGOs. And we don't just work with anybody, we work with people who are committed to getting relief to the right people and to complying with our reporting standards so that we know that it's making it to the right people. So you can see here in this green area, this is where most of our relief goes. This is the opposition held territory that I mentioned. And so you can see here that we avoid the opposition held territory as we make those deliveries. So a lot of our relief goes through Turkey here and into the opposition held territory, or we travel across southern Turkey. We actually go into Iraq. We work with some displaced Syrian communities here, but we also sometimes go back into Syria through the Iraqi Syrian border. So that's one thing that we do to ensure that things aren't being diverted. We avoid the Syrian regime held territories. And then our reporting standards, we get photos, we get videos, we get a lot of information about who is receiving the products that we send. And we know that 2 million unique individual people have benefited from our relief because of the level of detail that we require. Ahed, is there anything else that you would add there?
I think you covered everything. I just want really to emphasize that I'm from there and I know exactly which organization should we be working with. So I know, and this is always like, this brings me to the question that I'm always like being asked: how do you make sure that the relief is being used by the right people? And always like, this is really my answer, because I came from there, so I know exactly with whom should we be working with, and the way that our aid should be distributed. We do most of our work in a campus, in an area where like the most really vulnerable people are relocated. So most of our work is there. And you can really tell from like the videos and the pictures that we receive, there are really like in a huge need. So we really like, we kind of like 100% sure that our aid is being used by the right people.
Absolutely. And I'll add to that quick too, because I meant to mention it when I talked about the weaponization of healthcare. Our executive director, he is also from Syria, and he, when he lived in Syria, operated a hospital that was treating everybody regardless of their political affiliation, how you would imagine a hospital to run. And because of that, he was targeted and came to the US and sought asylum. And so between him and Ahed and their connection with their home community, that really opened a lot of doors for us to be connected, to build trust between communities in Syria, so that we could partner with the right people and get aid to where it needed to go.
This is a tremendous undertaking for your organization, and with such a small staff. I mean, it's really, really remarkable. There's another question here from Marcy, and she writes, I have read about the so-called presidential election being staged by the Assad regime on May 26th. Would you be able to address the reason or symbolism for this farce?
I really don't know how to answer this question. But the thing is, when we say election in Syria, that doesn't reflect in like even 1% when we say election in the United States. So having election in Syria, you have previous result of 99% of that the Syrian regime is going to be Bashar al-Assad or al-Assad family. And there is a picture being used multiple times of like how many presidents of the United States being in a like running throughout the history, and how many presidents we have in Syria. So you have guys like about 12 or maybe I think 13 presidents in the United States, and we have only one was the father, Hafez al-Assad, and then Bashar al-Assad came after him. So we don't really have an election in Syria. It's all just game and propaganda.
Thank you. Another question here comes from Olivia, and she asks, what advice would you give to other US groups working with refugees or IDPs in conflict zones, or working on other humanitarian projects, not necessarily relief aid, to maintain empathy and compassion?
The advice is to really to kind of help the population. For example, in Syria, all what we ask is just for the Syrian regime to be out of the Syria and to have kind of free election and to have just human rights knowledge. We don't really have that basic things. When we asked for the Syrian regime to leave Syria, we had this kind of idea in our mind that we will get help from the international community, and we will be we will see what was happening in Libya and in other Arab countries when they got help from the international community, and they finally were able to kick out the dictatorships from these Arab countries. So we thought we will have the same privilege, but unfortunately we don't, and still struggle. I'm not sure what advice I should give, but I think we don't really want to be refugees. I love being here, but also I love my country. And if the Syrian regime gone from Syria tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, I'll be there. And this is most of my friends and the people who I'm in contact with. They don't want to be refugees. They don't want help from anyone. They really just want to live in dignity in their own countries. So yeah, I think the help that I am hoping from the international community to just take the Syrian regime out of Syria so we can all go back there.
Yeah, and I would just add, not being part of the Syrian community, it's really important for me to know people who are, who have lived the experiences that are, not accessible to me, and to believe their stories and to hear their truth, and to, surround myself with people who are, plugged into what is going on, because I think otherwise it's difficult to convince talk yourself into having empathy if it's just the idea of empathy versus really hearing stories of what people are going through. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot going on in the US that deserves our attention as well. And I know that there are important conversations happening in our country about how we can improve ourselves. And I think it's really important for me to balance, to not assess what is happening elsewhere or here. And if I'm paying attention to what's going on here, that I can't pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world. You can hold both of those things and be plugged in and not put your head into the sand just because it's so overwhelming. I know that it can be very overwhelming, but not to give into the temptation to just shut it off, and to be compassionate and listen and be tuned into what's happening.
So one final question for both of you, and Ahed, you kind of touched on this, but this crisis has been going on, as you said, for 10 years now. How, or can you see an end to this crisis, and what would it look like?
Actually, I can't see any end. No, I feel like we kind of stuck in this era where we can't go back and we can't move forward. And yeah, I don't see any end. And if there is an end, I don't think the end that most of Syrians are aiming for, which is to have really free election and to have kind of our own identity, let's say. So yeah, I can't see the end. But also on the other hand, I'm really happy, and I think I saw some question that about what brings joy to me in the mid of everything. we see Syrians all over the world are being super successful, and we've heard a lot of really success stories of Syrians invented things and being great at other things. And yeah, I think this is what's really not the end, but this is like the hope for the future. When one day we can all go back, we will go back with all this huge experience that people gained from the US and Canada and from the European Union countries. So I feel like we do have, we aim for a good end, even though it's not clear when, but I think, yeah, this is really great to think about, of people who forced to leave and forcibly displaced. Now they are making the super success stories. And yeah, this is what really gives me hope for the end.
Well, I said that was the last question, but actually I just want to follow it up with one more question that came in on Facebook from Jerry, who says, what are some ways that we as individuals here can help?
Tell the people the right story, inform them, advocate for Syrians. It's easy to say civil war, but it's much harder to explain the pain and the uprising that people believed in and they really sacrificed their life for. So just, yeah, don't really say civil war. This is like most importantly to me. Yeah, just kind of like inform people of what's going on. Hear the stories, hear the first version of the story from the ground. Do some research and learn about Syrians. Some people tell me, oh, you look not like a refugee. And it just like really like shocked me, like how I should be look like. I'm a Syrian, and most of Syrians, they look like me and I look like them. So yeah, just kind of like inform yourself, inform the people around you. And maybe if you are like, you have the capacity to help financially and maybe mentally or logistically or anything, so don't really hesitate. Do your research and go forward with what you want to do.
Thank you both so much. And thank you, Ahed, for sharing your personal story, and Hope for the great work that you are doing. Deanna writes in the chat, she says, I won't put my head in the sand. Definitely we can all work towards educating more people and communicating this really important crisis and hopefully bringing it closer to an end. So thank you both so very much. And thank you to everybody who joined in to today's program to learn about this, and for being part of our Lunch and Learn program. This program today was recorded, so you can find it on our website starting tomorrow. Please share it with others. You'll also find our other Lunch and Learn presentations. The views and information or opinions expressed today and in these programs are those of the individuals involved and don't necessarily represent those of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. I want to give a very special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of this show behind the scenes. Also, a huge thank you to our Executive Director, Dee Simon, and our entire team at the Holocaust Center, Nicole Bella, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Sydney Draytell, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, Rick Brewer, Katie Lawrence, and Morgan Romero. I hope you'll be able to join us next week to hear from Paul Karamera, a Rwandan who explains how he and his family, who were already living as refugees in Uganda, were impacted by the Rwandan genocide and their eventual return to Rwanda. Thank you so much again for joining us today, and this concludes our program.